Suan's ePortfolio on a House for Mr. Biswas by V.S. Naipaul. Hey there! Fancy seeing you here. My name is Suan Yi, and people sometimes call me Sue. I'm currently a second-year English Language and Communication undergraduate at UCSI University. Welcome to this ePortfolio, a collection of thoughts and reflections on the novel A House for Mr. Biswas, written by world-acclaimed author Sir Vidyadhar Suraj Prasad Naipaul. With each journal entry is a piece of original line art. So sit back, relax, and enjoy as I bring you along with me into the world of A House for Mr. Biswas. A House for Mr. Biswas follows the life of protagonist Mr. Mohan Biswas, a Hindu Trinidadian, as he grapples with the search for freedom and for a house of his own. Mr. Biswas has never had an easy childhood. He later marries into the Tulsi family, only to find himself more miserable. The novel follows Mr. Biswas's pursuit of a house he can call his own. It earned a spot on the list of the 100 best novels of the 20th century. Born in 1932, Sir V.S. Naipaul is the eldest son of a second-generation Indian. He spent the early years of his life on gaining education in Trinidad, and later studied in Oxford after winning a government scholarship. He was once a writer for the BBC's Caribbean Voices program. V.S. Naipaul is known for his works that portray the Trinidadian society. Some of his award-winning works include Miguel Street, written in 1959, and Mr. Stone and the Knight's Companion, written in 1963. Journal Entry 1. Prologue Reflection and a Memorable Quote. Featuring Line Art 1. Sect. A quote from the prologue that stuck with me was the opening line, and I quote, "10 weeks before he died, Mr. Mohan Biswas, a journalist of Sikkim Street, St. James, Port of Spain, was sacked." The opening line surprised me because stories usually open with a gentle and less thought-provoking introduction to the characters and settings, followed by a plot leading up to the climax. Death is usually used by authors later in the story to add an element of suspense and provoke emotions in its readers. However, in this prologue, the author chooses to reveal the death of one of the story's characters right at the start, giving the story a menacing aura. Similar to a sales pitch that starts with a killer attention statement, this opening line evoked my curiosity. Who is Mr. Biswas? How did he die? Why was he sacked? Captivating me further into reading the book. Though Mr. Biswas's character and how he led an arduous life is yet to develop in the opening line, it got me thinking about life's fragility and how where we stand in society, our prized possessions, and the things we strive and live for can be stripped away at any given moment. Who knew that Mr. Biswas would be dead 10 weeks later when his employer decided to sack him? Who knew that he was to be sacked in the first place? Such is life. We never know. Mr. Biswas's death is the end to a strenuous life and the beginning to a story that can educate its readers on the reality of life and what to do or not to do about it. This reminds me of a quote by Soren Kierkegaard that I strongly believe in. Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Journal Entry 2. Impression on Mr. Biswas's character based on the pastoral chapter. Featuring Line Art 2. The Birth of Mr. Biswas. Mr. Biswas's character, as portrayed by the author, evokes feelings of nothing but sympathy for the rejection and for the way he was brought into the world, an ominous beginning to his miserable life. From the moment of his birth, his family associated him with no luck and as someone who will eat up his own mother and father. Think about that. The impressions that I have towards Mr. Biswas's character is pitiful and unfortunate. Not only did his birth not bring joy and celebration to his family, like the birth of other babies, it brought upon fear and disgust, as Mr. Biswas was six-fingered and born in the wrong way. Even when poor Mr. Biswas sneezed, a mere act of expelling air from his nose and mouth, his very own father left the house because he was convinced that his son's sneeze was inauspicious. Mr. Biswas was labelled as a leecher and a spendthrift, and possibly a liar as well, even before he had the ability to differentiate right from wrong, to stand up for himself, and to prove his family and the pundit wrong. He didn't choose to be born with 6 fingers. He didn't choose to be born at midnight, such an inauspicious hour. And he most definitely didn't choose to be born to such a superstitious family. So, why did he have to be the black sheep of the family? Why did he have to bear consequences for the choices he never got the chance to make? This all changed one night, when he lost his 6th finger. He was then treated with attention and respect. So, does this family love the luck or the child? Such a pity. Mr. Biswas's birth and tragic childhood reminds me that parenting is an acquired skill. It takes love, patience, and nothing less than what a helpless and defenseless child deserves. Journal Entry 3. Is Mr. Biswas an anti-hero? With literary terms. Featuring line art 3. Mr. Biswas, an anti-hero. Biswas certainly is an anti-hero, moving through phases after phases of hardship. In Part 1, Chapter 3 of the novel, The Tulsis, Mr. Biswas tries time and again to reorganize his life and his fate, but always fails because of his low self-esteem. Mr. Biswas was most of the time uncertain about the decisions that he has made on his quest to change his fate. When he was asked if he would marry Shama, Mr. Biswas first felt reluctant, but later began feeling that it was he who had acted and was unwilling to believe that it was he who had acted foolishly, and convinced himself that the girl was good-looking and there would be a handsome dowry. As much as Mr. Biswas portrays himself to be resilient when it comes to having a better life, it is ironic that he does not practice what he preaches. Mr. Biswas claims that he's a man of progress when he expresses his belief in the teachings of the Aryans. Mr. Biswas was almost an Aryan convert. However, he still expects a handsome dowry and a wife who brings him food, despite his hatred towards her. Besides, the imagery that Naipaul uses illustrates Biswas as a bland and disappointing character. Mr. Biswas was happy to return to Pagotis, in the large, musty hall, with the sooty kitchen at one end, the furniture-choked landing on one side, and the dark cobwebbed loft on the other. See, even the Hanuman house was described in a similar manner, bland and disappointing when seen through the eyes of Mr. Biswas. Furthermore, there was always a juxtaposition between Mr. Biswas and other members of the Tulsi family. He had hoped that marrying into the Tulsis would change his fate, but the narrative around Mr. Biswas's life had not changed at all, and is still as miserable as ever. He had always thought of the house without him, and whether the people in it would miss him. Even in his own home, in Tara's back veranda, Ajoda sat relaxed in his rocking chair, his eyes closed, listening perhaps to That Body of Yours being read by Rabidat, who sat at an awkward angle, trying to hide the smell of drink and tobacco on his breath. Nobody paid much attention to Mr. Biswas's absence, let alone his presence. From the irony of not practicing what he preaches, to the disappointing character, to the way he was treated by the Tulsis, the claim that Mr. Biswas is an anti-hero might just be an understatement. Journal Entry 4. Naipaul's illustration of the diaspora community of Indians in the West Indies and his pessimism. Featuring line art 4, Diaspora Community of Indians. In Part 1, Chapter 1, The Pastoral of a House for Mr. Biswas, Naipaul illustrates the diaspora community of Indians in the West Indies as superstitious individuals. During the birth of Mr. Biswas, he was considered by the midwife to be born in the wrong way due to the presence of a sixth finger. Upon hearing this, Bipti's father immediately equated Mr. Biswas's condition to his personal luck. "I knew it. There's no luck for me." The midwife proceeded to correct Mr. Biswas's inauspicious birth by bringing back leaves of cactus, cutting them into strips, and hanging a strip over every door, every window, and every aperture through which an evil spirit may enter the hut. It feels as if Mr. Biswas had the alleged power of attracting evil into the house and the family. He was even deemed capable of eating up his own mother and father. All these allegations were based solely upon the fact that he was born with an extra finger and at an odd hour, depicting how superstitious the diaspora Indian community was. Furthermore, the diaspora Indian community is illustrated by Naipaul as one that is unnecessarily thrifty with regards to monetary resources. One of the novel's characters, Raghu, kept a check on every cent he gave her, counted every biscuit in the tin, and would rather walk 10 miles rather than pay a cart a penny. Raghu's behavior resulted in feelings of disbelief amongst those around him as they went on rocking the implement in the earth, tearing the roots that kept the earth firm, and looked for Raghu's hidden treasures, giving out an aura of greed and materialism. V.S. Naipaul's pessimism towards the diaspora Indian community in the West Indies shows through the illustration of the characters in the pastoral chapter. The behavior of the characters is a reflection of the financial state of the community in the 1960s when they struggled to make ends meet. Despite the fact that Raghu was perceived to be rich by those around him, Naipaul decided to highlight the poverty of the diaspora community by revealing that he wasn't actually as rich as people thought he was after his death. Journal Entry 5. What's most memorable about the novel and how it represents Commonwealth literature? A House for Mr. Biswas is a representation of the colonial era in a world full of people who are scattered far from their birthplace, trying to find their identity. The hardships of these people, especially the diaspora Indian community in Trinidad, was documented in a memorable way, a way of fiction, by V.S. Naipaul. Since the novel was inspired by the author's own father, I cannot begin to imagine, had it been true, that there were people who had to live lives as miserable as the one Mr. Biswas had. From the alienation because of the time and way he was born, to the death of his father Raghu, to being dominated by the Tulsis after his marriage to Shama. Despite the fact that the Indian community was not living in their homelands, the unshaken faith they had towards their culture and religious beliefs was something that I found to be very respectable. They had never forgotten their pujas and pandits, although they were in a place where the majority of the people were non-Hindus. Mr. Biswas was born in Trinidad, where the Indian community bears the status of laborers. Now think about it. Had he been born in his homeland, he would be considered a Brahmin, and life would have been colossally, completely different for him. Mr. Biswas never had the privilege of living his life based on the Hindu caste system. His social class was replaced by a colonial one. The poverty and alienation he grew up with shaped him into a man who believed that it is only when he has a house of his own that he will truly feel accomplished and free from the dominance of others. Mr. Biswas's life was said to resemble the life of V.S. Naipaul's father, and many have said that a house for Mr. Biswas serves as a voice for the diaspora community in the West Indies. It isn't just a story of how the Indian community in Western countries have made it, have succeeded despite being immigrants. It's not. It's a raw depiction of the struggles that they have gone through as a result of the colonial era. Ultimately, my biggest takeaway from this piece by B.S. Naipaul is that as much as we should be resilient and progress from the past and the hardships that our ancestors have been through, never ever forget the ones who have oppressed us. Remember that for who we are today, we owe a lot of it to our ancestors, for we are who we are because they were who they were. Had V.S. Naipaul not written A House for Mr. Biswas, we as a country that was once colonized by the British as well, may never understand our roots and may take for granted the peace that was presented to us on a plate from the day we were born. Some final thoughts. The impression that A House for Mr. Biswas left on me is that it is a very complete story that covers the life of Mr. Biswas from his first to last breath and everything in between. The language and literary items used by V.S. Naipaul was comfortable and easy to read. But below the surface of the language used and the story of Mr. Biswas's journey of finding a place of his own that he can call home, lies a series of emotions for every little event that happened in the protagonist's life. It is the feeling of subtle empathy and sadness inside me, but also rage at the same time. Not the kind of sadness and anger that will make me cry, but the kind that sends me a message that I will keep with me for a long time. So, thank you for coming on this journey with me. That's the end of the portfolio.